This is a brief discussion of Ambedkar's book Buddha and his Dhamma as per the Columbia University collection. In the very beginning, Ambedkar seems to claim that Buddhism is a scientific religion. So we shall look closely at the non-scientific elements that Ambedkar himself has included in this book. Like other religious people, for example, Muslims looking for signs in the Quran and Vedists looking for signs in the Vedas, there are a bunch of Buddhists looking for modern science in Buddhism. Like this guy looking for quantum mechanics in Buddhism. In that sense, the Buddhists may be no different from others deluded religious people. Why was there a need for Ambedkar to claim that Buddhism was scientific? Is it worthwhile for his followers to accept all the irrational beliefs associated with Buddhism? How will it be different from following any other irrational religion? So early on in the unpublished version of the preface, Ambedkar claims that Buddhism appeals to a scientific person. He says, "I regard the Buddha's Dhamma to be the best. No religion can be compared to it. If a modern man who knows science must have a religion, the only religion he can have is the religion of the Buddha. This conviction has grown in me after 35 years of close study of all religions. But why should a man have any religion? What is the need?" Anyways, there is a typographic error here. Plus, many of the paragraphs he has written later forbids such a clear or emphatic statement that it is scientific, that Buddhism is scientific. And within this book itself, Ambedkar has included many irrational elements like rebirth, speaking with gods, anti-gravity, etc. In the section about different views of the Buddha's Dhamma, Ambedkar says, "No two followers of Buddha or the students of Buddhism agree on what exactly is Buddhism. That is, there is so much confusion." Further, he states, "To some, Buddhism is esoteric. To others, it is exoteric. To some, it is a system of barren metaphysics. To some, it is sheer mysticism," and so on. So, naturally, if one is seeing science in it, it must be due to personal preferences and personal interpretations. We may never know what exactly the Buddha said. We only know what others said using his name and what others recorded about his teachings. In the introductory section, Ambedkar says, "Indeed, it would not be an exaggeration to say that of all the founders of religions in the world, the presentation of the life and teachings of the founder of Buddhism presents a problem which is quite puzzling, if not baffling." In fact, Ambedkar even raises doubts about the common story we hear about how Buddha ended up being frustrated with the mundane life and became a renunciate or parivraja. Why did the Buddha take parivraja? The traditional answer is that he took parivraja because he saw a dead person, a sick person, and an old person. This answer is absurd. Ambedkar says, because Buddha supposedly became a renunciate around 30 years of age, and it is impossible for a person to not see such things, death, sickness, and old age, etc., for such a long time. It is just not logical. From an entirely different perspective, I would say this story does not make sense because ultimately Buddha did not find any solutions to end these kinds of suffering. For example, he did not find a solution for ending deaths, for ending diseases, for ending old age, or for ending poverty, etc. Probably he was more concerned about how to not get depressed when we witness these kinds of events in the real world. For example, his methods will in no way help invent a medicine for malaria or even discover the root causes of malaria. Even on the aspects of his teachings and his philosophy, Ambedkar raises questions. He raises doubts about the usual formulation of the Four Noble Truths. He questions, do they form part of the original teachings of the Buddha? This formula cuts at the root of Buddhism. If life is sorrow, death is sorrow, and rebirth is sorrow, then there is an end of everything. Neither religion nor philosophy can help a man to achieve happiness in the world. If there is no escape from sorrow, then what can religion do? What can Buddha do to relieve man from sorrow? Besides the diversity of views, later scholars of Pali and Buddhist scholars from Sri Lanka, who claim to have the original version of the 2000-year-old Tipitaka, have claimed that early Europeans who translated Buddha's teachings relied heavily on the Sanskrit mistranslations of the original Pali works. For example, in Pali texts, these truths are termed as Ariya Sach, where Ariya could mean understood or perceived, like in the Dravidian words Ari or Arivu, rather than noble as in Arya. Since Ariya was translated as Arya by Sanskrit guys, Europeans translated it as Four Noble Truths instead of terming it as perceived or understood truths. Further, some modern Buddhists claim that Sanskrit translators wrongly interpreted Majjhima Patipada as the middle path. According to them, Majji is same as intoxicated with sense pleasure, and Ma is getting released from. You can also search for the meaning in this excellent link wisdomlib.org, which says the word Madhyapan we use for alcohol is related with the Pali word Majjapan. So, Majjhima means getting released from the intoxication of sense pleasure. Hence, this is not really the middle path. It is still more like asceticism. So, coming back to the Four Noble Truths, Ambedkar says that it is in its typical formulation, the four Aryan truths deny hope to man. The four Aryan truths make the gospel of Buddha a gospel of pessimism. Do they form part of the original gospel, or are they a later accretion by the monks? So it looks like Ambedkar wants to get rid of this Four Noble Truths formulation. In fact, in his book Buddha and his Dhamma, there is no section or chapter with title Four Noble Truths. He does not explicitly discuss them as an important concept of Buddhism. Further in the text, Ambedkar discusses some stories related with the Buddha, which sound outright unscientific to the modern person. But Ambedkar does not seem to be critical of these stories. For example, there is an episode where Buddha is flirting with anti-gravity and also interpreting dreams as an indicator of some real possible events in the future. Buddha was always hopeful of finding a way, so much so that on the night of the day on which he partook of the food sent by Sujata, Gautama had 5 dreams. And when he awoke, he interpreted his dreams to mean that he was sure to attain enlightenment. So maybe he believed in dreams as a form of precognition, which is not scientific. And he believed in predicting future events using illogical means. That is, he had also tried to forecast his future. This he did by throwing the bowl of food Sujata's maid brought into the river Nairanjana, saying, "If I am to have enlightenment, let the bowl ascend the stream. If not, let it go down." The vessel indeed began to float against the current and at last sank near the abode of Kala, a Naga king. So this is like anti-gravity, which is obviously not possible. But if we strip away all these magical and supernatural events and statements, what he really attempted might be this sort of enlightenment. It's more of a problem-solving process. Gautama concentrated himself on the problem of finding an answer to the question which had troubled him. So he is using the technique of introspection to solve the problem he has. On the night of the last day of the fourth week, light dawned upon him. He realized that there were two problems. The first problem was that there was suffering in the world. And the second problem was how to remove this suffering and make mankind happy. But the unscientific concepts in the stories do not stop after his enlightenment phase. For example, Ambedkar claims that Buddha had multiple rebirths. He says a bodhisattva must be a bodhisattva for 10 lives in succession. What must a bodhisattva do in order to qualify himself to become a Buddha? In his first life, he acquires mudita or joy. In his second life, he acquires vimala or purity. The bodhisattva has now removed all thoughts of lust. He is kind to all. He neither flatters the vices of men nor disparages their virtues. In his third life, he acquires prabhakari or brightness. The intellect of the bodhisattva now becomes as bright as a mirror. He fully knows and grasps the truths of anatta and anicca. His only wish is for the highest wisdom, and for this he is ready to sacrifice anything. And so on, Ambedkar describes all the 10 rebirths. Here we should note that in Sanskrit texts and English translations, the term anatta appears as anatma or no self. But some modern Buddhist scholars seem to suggest that anatta must be more like anatha, not anatma. And it should be translated as not in control. So if this error is there, then that may deeply impact the interpretations of his entire philosophy. So first of all, we may not even know what the Buddha actually taught, and therefore making claims that it is scientific or non-scientific is absurd. Ambedkar further justifies that these rebirth stories in Jataka as Brahminic theories of avatar. It is analogous. In this sense, both Buddhism and Brahminism are unscientific probably. Among the philosophers that preceded the Buddha, Buddha seems to be inspired by Kapila and his Sankhya philosophy. For purposes of proving the truth, Kapila allowed only two means of proof. One, perception, and two, inference. Seems Kapila is not taking the scriptural words as his proof. In that sense, he may be considered rational. In his work on Lokayata, published slightly after Ambedkar's death, Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay convincingly argues that Sankhya essentially sprang out from the ancient Indian materialistic philosophy, which was associated with asuras. Speaking about the Sankhya, he says, we have already seen the cosmogony attributed by the Gita to the asuras. The world was the effect of the sexual urge, and it was born as a result of the union of the male and the female. And Gaudapada, in his commentary on the Sankhya Karika, mentioned the same cosmogony. Gaudapada says, as the birth of a child proceeds from the union of male and female, so the production of creation results from the union of Prakriti and Purusha. Sankhya thought, which was originally fully atheistic and materialistic, was submitted to a process of rigorous spiritualization, and idealistic contents were grafted onto it in such a manner that at last the original Sankhya passed into its opposite. This is what Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay says. So here in this book by Ambedkar, it may not be clear which version of Sankhya the Buddha was adopting. Kapila also proposed that the objects in the world evolved due to the activities of three gunas or characteristics called the sattva, the rajas and the tamas. When three gunas are not in balance, the universe becomes dynamic and evolution begins. And that this imbalance in the three gunas was due to the presence of dukkha or suffering. That is, dukkha creates imbalance in the universe. Looks like Kapila is shifting from describing the material universe to describing states of human mind. Or does he mean the universe itself starts suffering? It is not clear who is the one suffering here. Is it the universe or is it the human? Besides these theories of the sattva, the rajas and the tamas do not exactly explain anything scientific about the origin or operations of the universe. Perhaps they may have some application in psychology, which we may explore later. So, of all the philosophers, the Buddha was greatly impressed by the doctrines of Kapila. He was the only philosopher whose teaching appeared to Buddha to be based on logic and facts. But he did not accept everything which Kapila taught. Only three things did the Buddha accept from Kapila. He accepted that reality must rest on proof and thinking must be based on rationalism, which sounds right. He accepted that there was no logical or factual basis for the presumption that God exists or that he created the universe. This also sounds rational. He accepted that there was dukkha or suffering in the world. So maybe this is why he preferred Kapila's theory, because he was interested in exploring this idea of dukkha. The rest of Kapila's teachings he just bypassed as being irrelevant for his purpose. So, Buddha does not seem to have accepted these three gunas based explanation. The main thing he seemed to have focused is on the aspect of this dukkha. After describing ancient version of Vedism, Ambedkar now turns to later evolution of Brahminical philosophy based on the Vedas, which also preceded Buddha's times. There are four theses on which the Brahminic philosophy rested. The first thesis was that Vedas are not only sacred, but that they are infallible and they are not to be questioned. Probably ancient Vedic time rishis did not know the full and final version of the Vedas, and also since they were only in the mode of composing it, they wouldn't have thought of it as infallible. Maybe they were questioning each other and also themselves. The second thesis of the Brahmanic philosophy was that the salvation of the soul, that is escape from transmigration, escape from transmigration can be had only by the due performance of Vedic sacrifices, the observances of religious rites and ceremonies, and offering of gifts to Brahmins. The Brahmins had not only a theory of an ideal religion as contained in the Vedas, but they also had a theory for an ideal society. The pattern of this ideal society they named Chaturvarna, or graded inequality in English. It is embedded in the Vedas. The Lokayatikas, or ancient Indian materialists, were among the many people who opposed these Vedic or Brahminic philosophies. The opponents of the sacrifices used to ridicule the Brahmins by saying, if one can go to heaven by sacrificing an animal, why should not one sacrifice one's own father? That would be a quicker way of going to heaven. The Buddha wholeheartedly agreed with this view. The theory of Chaturvarna was as repugnant to the Buddha as the theory of sacrifices was repulsive to him. Buddha also seems to have revolted against the Brahminical version of karma theory. He says the law of karma as formulated by the Brahmins thought the Buddha was calculated to sap the spirit of revolt completely. That is, the karma theory was calculated to sap the spirit of revolt completely. No one was responsible for the suffering of man except he himself. Revolt could not alter the state of suffering, for suffering was fixed by his past karma as his lot in this life. Then Ambedkar turns his attention towards Upanishads, which also preceded the time of Buddha. According to Ambedkar, the main thesis of the Upanishads was that Brahma was a reality and that Atma was same as the Brahma. The Atma did not realize that it was Brahma because of the upadhis in which it was entangled. The Buddha could not find any proof in support of the thesis of that Brahma was a reality. He therefore rejected the thesis of the Upanishads. So, to summarize, the Buddha rejected belief in the infallibility of the Vedas, belief in moksha or salvation of the soul, that is, its ceasing to be born again, belief in the efficacy of rites, ceremonies, and sacrifices as means of obtaining moksha, belief in Chaturvarna as the ideal for social organization, belief in Ishvara as the creator of and in Brahma as the principle underlying the universe. Definitely, these are pretty rational ideas, I must say. Any rational person would reject them. Ambedkar also would have been impressed by Buddha here. And these are the things he modified or accepted. So, the Buddha accepted great grand law of cause and effect with its corollaries, which is okay, it sounds rational. But he replaced the view of karma by a much more scientific view of karma. He put new wine in old bottle. This new wine actually also sounds pretty unscientific to me, because in later chapters, while trying to defend the Buddhist version of karma theory, Ambedkar seems to create some logical conundrums and confusions. We can discuss that later. Transmigration was replaced by the doctrine of rebirth. Definitely, this is also not scientific. And he replaced the doctrine of moksha or salvation of the soul by the doctrine of nibbana. Because of translation errors and divergent views, this term nibbana may not be fully clear. According to me, nibbana or nirvana is not extinguishing of the self as is popularly understood. It is only extinction of raga or anger, dvesha or hatred, lobha, greed, moha, which is delusion, especially due to emotional attachment, etc. These kinds of things, which are together called as Arishad Vargas in Sanskrit literature. And getting rid of prejudices and such negative aspects of the soul. And obviously, introspection is the technique by which we can watch these thoughts arising in our mind. When uncontrolled, these thoughts lead to depression, suffering, destruction, etc. I don't see why this simple observation or conclusion be termed as awakening, enlightenment, etc. That is just hyping and romanticizing the concept. It's just a simple concept which any normal person can realize with some introspection. So this aspect, Nibbana in this form sounds pretty rational to me and acceptable as a person of science. Let us now move on to the part where Buddha has already achieved Nirvana. In the immediate aftermath, seems he had self-doubts about should he preach his ideas or not. After having attained enlightenment and after having formulated his way, doubt arose in the mind of the Buddha. Should he go forth and preach his doctrine, or should he continue to devote himself to his own personal perfection? It is hard for mankind to give up its belief in the immortality of the soul and accept my doctrine that soul as an independent entity does not exist and does not survive after death. Mankind is intent on its selfishness and takes delight and pleasure in it. It is hard for mankind to accept my doctrine of righteousness overriding selfishness. Thus, as he reflected, his mind turned to inaction, not to teaching of the gospel. Then Brahma Sahampati, knowing what was passing in the mind of the Buddha, thought, verily the world is being destroyed. Verily the world is going to destruction. If the Tathagata, the fully enlightened, turns to inaction and not to teaching his doctrine. Filled with anxiety, Brahma Sahampati left the Brahma world and appeared before the Buddha. And arranging his upper robe on one shoulder, he bent down with clasped hands and said, Thou art no longer Siddhartha Gautama. Thou art the Buddha. Thou art the blessed one who is blessed with the fullest enlightenment. Thou art the Tathagata. How can thou refuse to enlighten the world? How can thou refuse to save erring humanity? So this guy Brahma Sahampati is some imaginary god with 4 heads and 4 arms in Buddhism. But he is not the same as the creator god Brahma as in Vedism. Looks like it is hard even for the Buddha to give up beliefs in imaginary gods and imaginary worlds. Anyways, these stories are parts of Buddhism and they have been trying to overhype and romanticize the ordinary solution discovered by the Buddha. Nirvana is a simple realization that any normal human being can have on their own without any Buddha teaching them anything. Probably we should get rid of all these personal stories and person worship cults and leave the concepts and ideas alone, just like some idea of an academic research. So finally, Buddha realized that he left the world because there was so much conflict, resulting in misery and unhappiness, and for which he knew no remedy. If he can banish misery and unhappiness from the world by the propagation of his doctrine, it was his duty to return to the world and serve it, and not sit silent as the personification of inactive impassivity. The Buddha therefore agreed to the request of Brahma Sahampati and decided to preach. So we end this here. We may take up analysis of his sermons in the future videos. Thanks for listening.